So if you didn't have to worry about all the politics and just said we need to account for all the externalities, um, the induced cost, if you will, of alcohol
Yeah.
use, how high would you think you would estimate the alcohol taxes should be in the aggregate between state and federal?
Yeah. Well, I think a wimpy answer to that question would be higher than they are today. I think that that's easy to justify. Um, Actually, much higher than they are today. Now, the question is, should they be $1 or $2 a drink? It depends on who you believe and what calculations you are. But there is something of a literature on that, which suggests that we can be very confident that any feasible increase that you could imagine would be in the right direction.
So you're suggesting 10 to 20 fold at least beyond what we are now at the
Yeah,
federal level?
the tax level in 1951 was even that probably was not high enough by modern standards.
I figured Jody would have something to say about that topic.
What do you think about drink taxes by location or just overall tax? So you could argue bars should be disproportionately taxed or something because there's drinking and driving involved. So I just want to know if you think the tax should be differentiated by location, trying to get the biggest negative externalities or not?
Uh, yes, I mean, I think as a first cut on it, that would make sense that on-premise drinking has higher externalities associated with it because of the damage that people do to and from the bar and sometimes inside of it. Um, so that would be a greater concern and hence would lead to a justification for a higher tax based on the principle that the drinker should pay for the expected damage that they're doing on a per drink basis. So
Karen?
of course, that's the yeah, and that would also lead to differentiation in other dimensions. I think there's a pretty good case that cities should have a higher tax than the suburbs and so forth. It, and that's part of the frustration why they don't. There's a very interesting discussion about whether uh, we should stay with the tradition of taxing hard alcohol, liquor higher than beer. And during Prohibition, for example, beer was known as the drink of moderation. But beer, of course, is also the drink of youths, and youths tend to have very high externalities associated with their drinking. In the U.S., I think the is it about 50% of fatalities, alcohol-related fatalities, are now beer-related? It's somewhere in that. Might be more than that. I think it's very hard to make the justification now that would say beer should be given a break, and that having a standard for tax per unit of ethanol would bring beer up to the level of liquor. It's another principle that seems important.
Carrie?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's especially true given trends in craft brewing, where the beers now have a higher alcohol content than they did previously. But I guess what I wanted to know was if you could talk a little bit about effect size. You mentioned that there was some of your talk involved the number of fatalities, for example, that are diverted by increasing taxes. But I wondered if you could talk more about that. What is the effect size for alcohol taxes compared with other policies, for example, or other types of prevention programs?
Yeah. So two things. The estimate that um, we did on the effect of the 1991 tax. Yes, I told you how many injury deaths we estimated were prevented. That worked out to about 4.5%. So it was a 6% increase in the alcohol, in the ratio of the alcohol price index to the CPI overall. So a 6% increase in average price resulted in a 4.5% reduction in injury fatalities, and a larger reduction in violent crime than that. So it was a notable increase or improvement in a variety of ways. But the other thing that I would say is that, you know, tax is much less socially costly than the other measures that are available. And the reason is because in the first instance, it's a transfer. So the you know, for any other system of education or law enforcement or other kinds of prevention activities, those are all costing the public money. But for taxation, it's the reverse. It's actually bringing more money and could result in a reduction in other taxes if you wanted to do it. The attraction of it is that it does have some social cost by the usual economic arguments, but it's low compared to other programs that we can imagine. And it is something that is under government control, at least in a technical sense. It's not like, let's change culture around drinking, you know, who knows how to do that? And it's effective.
So I have one question, but first we'll hear from David and Kit, and then we'll need to move on.
Okay, so I want to just throw in a couple of points, and then I have a couple of questions. First, you mentioned that WHO has recommended tobacco taxes. You're probably aware they also recommend alcohol taxes. And in fact, globally, alcohol taxes are one of the most common things that governments do about alcohol, more common than awareness campaigns. It's interesting globally what happens, not so much here. You asked the cost of the externalities. The CDC estimate is that it's $2.05 a drink is the cost of alcohol, so that gives you a sense of how high the tax would have to
Not in New
be.
York City.
No, $2.05 per drink, the cost of the
Oh, the
externalities.
externality.
Yeah. Yeah.
2005.
Yeah, no. The Jody's questions about location, I mean, my concern about that, and maybe you want to comment on this, is you wouldn't want to have unintended consequences like they've gotten in the UK now, where we don't have minimum pricing here. The UK, the shift from on-premise to off-premise drinking, partly as a result of discounting in off-premise outlets. But with the price differential prices so much lower in off-premise outlets, then the drinking shifts to the off-premise outlets, and you have a completely different kind of problem. People drink at home or they drink at private parties, then they get in their cars. So
You don't get in your car if you drink at home.
yes, but they do if they drink at private parties, and there's a lot of drinking at private parties.
And you do if you're a college student.
And there's a lot of college student drinking at private parties, and I have those data. My questions, though, are here in the U.S. at the federal level, you're probably aware that there's a bill moving through from Ron Wyden, among others, of Oregon, that would drop the tax rate, that would give a tax break by changing the categories. So it would lift the percent level for beer, in order to bring in the craft beers to the lower tax rate that other beers currently enjoy. And it would also lift the tax rate, lift the barrier for wine, increasing the table wine definition up to 16%. I believe there's another piece in there for distilled spirits too, but those are the beer and wine ones. Are you aware of those? Do you know if anybody's doing any modeling? I knew you guys have modeled what the tax increase, the Bush tax increase, the lives it saved, but is anybody doing any modeling of what the lives would be cost by such a drop in the federal alcohol tax. So that was number one. And number two is you talk primarily about excise taxes, but there's also sales tax. And my sense of literature is there's very little research that's been done on the effects of sales taxes as opposed to excise taxes. We analyzed the effect of the 3% sales tax increase in Maryland and found it led to about a 3.5% drop in consumption across the board, which is substantially higher than you would expect from excise taxes. So I wondered if you wanted to comment on excise versus sales as well. So the two questions: the federal tax increase effect, tax decrease effects, and excise versus sales.
Good, thanks. I mean, I think just on the second one, the sales tax is attractive for one reason because it tends to rise with inflation. And I mean, that's been the big sticking point on excise taxes because they are unit taxes and because they're quoted in nominal terms, just so many cents per gallon, that it does require action on the part of the legislature to keep them up with inflation. The problem with the sales tax is that it ends up being much higher on higher quality versions of the source of ethanol, and there's no particular public health reason why you would do that, right? I mean, I think that David, you'd agree with me on that. You wouldn't want to tax fine wine at a fabulously higher rate than you do the cheap stuff. So the unit tax, the ad valorem tax is poorly targeted, but it's automatic because it increases with the prices of the goods, and that's the trade-off. There is a kind of intermediate possibility, which would be economist nirvana, and that would be if we had the tax quoted as so many cents per gallon, but then with a tied to the consumer price index so that it automatically increased unless there was some explicit action. And of course, we have that with Social Security pension payments and a variety of other things. You could imagine building that into, so you could have a well-targeted tax that focused on this question of craft beer. I have not been following that, and I'm sure you're much better informed than I have. I do think it's a mistake that the federal excises are not, over a wide range of alcohol concentrations are not tied to the amount of alcohol in a beer or wine. And so you could have a 3% or 6% pays the same tax, and yeah, and this would make it worse. And so that then they would start saying it, a 10% Belgian beer or something would be. So the one tax that we have at the federal level that is tied explicitly to alcohol content is the liquor tax, and that's been true from the beginning.
Is there any differential impact in rural areas versus urban areas? There's a smaller menu of options for prevention in rural areas.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm not aware of it. I mean, it's hard to do these studies, partly because the experiment has been performed only weekly, and unlike tobacco in recent years, where we've had these very large tax increases and are able to really see what difference it's making, the typical action at the state level is quite small, and so that you might be predicting a couple % change in whatever your outcome measure is. Then to start trying to differentiate between rural versus urban or some of the others, it becomes very tough.
So,
Yet another reason why it would be good to have large tax increases.
Well, the committee will consider this.
Last-
I know we're running late, but I would love to get your thoughts on, at least very briefly, on how we overcome the political barriers. We all understand the power of the industry, the power of, because many of us are consumers of alcohol, and it's not totally vilified like tobacco. What do you see as the major obstacles that we could actually begin to address to enable the taxation or pricing to be addressed more directly?
Yeah, I wish I had the wisdom to give a good answer to that. All I can tell you is my experience over the years has been that when I have a chance to talk to a lay audience and an audience of people that may be progressive and not particularly concerned about the economic fate of the alcohol industry, it's a very hard sell. It is hard to persuade them that a modest change in the excise tax on alcohol is going to make any difference at all. And I always get pushback from that, saying, stories about, oh, it wouldn't make any difference to me, if my six-pack cost 50 cents more, I would still, and so on and so on. So a modest proposal would be if we could find, Jernigan here or somebody to go out there and go on the road and really persuade the public that this works. And I guess they have been persuaded about tobacco. I don't.
Well, yeah.
But this argument is much easier to say, we don't want anyone to smoke for their benefit, for everybody's, but it's like clear, it's sort of like the sugar tax.
Yeah.
It's harder to sell a sugar tax because you don't want to say, I never want anyone ever again to have any sugar. So it's the same thing with alcohol. We don't want to say no one should ever drink again. We want to say you shouldn't drink and do something bad and drive. So it's much harder to do the hard sell because it's a complicated behavior you're trying to change. You're not trying to wipe out alcohol from everyone's diet. So that's what's easy about tobacco, and people can really join in on it. It's harder. And also because few people smoke now, so it's really easy to say you want everyone else to quit, but lots of people enjoy their alcohol without harm. So it's just a harder story.
Well,
and it has more complications in it.
Yeah, I think, and we can talk about it, but the thing, at least in my mind, that pushed the tobacco thing over was the fact of secondhand smoke. And so these tangible harms to third parties, whether it's the victims of automobile crashes or of domestic violence or assault, are likely to be things that say, yeah, those are problems. But anyway, we can have that discussion. But thank you very much. That's been enlightening, and so we appreciate your being here.